So as I mentioned, on the exams, I will not cover common naming, but you will see common names in your text and on bottles in the lab. And so I want you to at least have seen and be familiar with where to find the information about common names. So when we have an alkyl group that has 3 carbons, we have our primary carbon and a secondary carbon. And we'll talk about what primary and secondary are in a minute. But let's just say that a primary carbon in this case is carbon 1 and the secondary carbon is carbon 2. If we remove a hydrogen from a terminal carbon and then attach that to a longer chain, we have what we call a propyl group as an alkyl group. Right? So we could even do this on a carbon molecule. And then we would have a propyl heptane because of the branch being 3 carbons long. And then if the connection to the longer chain is at the second carbon in a 3 carbon group, we call this an isopropyl group. And I like to think of isopropyl groups as being the top half of a Y. So that when we draw the skeletal structure, it looks like we have added a Y as a branch. And that just keeps the isopropyl type structure in my brain. There are 2 ways to draw an isopropyl chloride, but if you just look at the structure in 3-dimensional space, you can see that whether you draw out your condensed or Lewis structure in this way or in this way, the 3-dimensional structures are equivalent. If I simply rotate in my hand this piece by about 30 degrees to the clockwise, then it will be in the same orientation as the structure on the left. So they are the same thing. For butyl groups, we are not going to worry about isobutyl or sec-butyl groups. The only structure here that we need to know is a tert-butyl group. We need to know that because the IUPAC has decided to use tert-butyl as a valid IUPAC naming option. And that is because chemists are lazy and it's easier to say tert-butyl. For example, what we have drawn to the lower left corner is a 4-T-butyl heptane. And if we neglected to use the shorthand of tert-butyl for that group, we would be calling it 4 parentheses 1,1,1 trimethyl close parentheses heptane. And we're lazy, so we like the tert-butyl shorthand, and we use a T to represent tert, and also to remind us that the tert-butyl group looks like a T. I should make sure that the circle only contains the group. Okay. So sometimes in the lab you will see a chemical that has an N in front of the name, and this could be like an N-pentane, or it could be in terms of a common name of a chemical such as N-butyl bromide. And what N means is that it is, technically N stands for normal. And what the scientists are calling normal in this case is an unbranched chain of carbons or straight chain alkane. All carbons are connected in series and there are no branches off. Okay, so we're going to learn a common nomenclature and a way to describe carbons and carbon bonds, and the characteristics of the hydrogens bonded to carbon. And this is very important to learn and to be familiar with. We are going to use this terminology every day from here forward. And you will be tested over it multiple times under different contexts. So what we're going to learn is a system of nomenclature called primary, secondary, and tertiary. Okay? You may have heard these terms before in Gen Chem, learning about protein structure. The primary structure of proteins is sequence, the secondary structure of proteins, alpha helixes and beta sheets, and then the tertiary structure of proteins in the three-dimensional shape. And then the quaternary structure of proteins is when we have multiple subunits associating. And so you may have heard these terms before, and here we're going to use them in a different context. They don't mean the same thing as in biology. So for us, we're going to call a primary carbon is bonded to only one other carbon. So these are usually at the end of a chain. It's either the first or last carbon in a chain. And this could even be for the first or last carbon in a branch going towards a longer chain. Okay? So if you look at the first structure that's in the middle of the slide on the left, this is representing a primary carbon, and connected to primary carbons we have primary hydrogens. So primary hydrogens are attached only to primary carbons. And then on a secondary carbon is bonded to two other carbons. And so this is usually in the middle of a chain. Okay. It's in the middle of a chain and it does not have a branch connected to that carbon. So an easy way to identify secondary carbon would be to find a carbon that is bonded to two hydrogens, or a carbon that is bonded to a hydrogen and a heteroatom. Okay, so this is in the middle is the molecule showing the secondary carbon. We can go through this entire slide and we can highlight, we can put a yellow square around all of the primary carbons in all three of the molecules. And those are all carbons that have only one other bond to carbon. Then we can go through in blue and put a blue square around all of these secondary carbons. And these are all the carbons that have two bonds to carbon. And then we can talk about tertiary carbons. Tertiary carbons are carbons that have 3 bonds to carbon. And I'll go through and put a maroon square around our tertiary carbon. There's only one example on this slide, and that is the carbon shown in the molecule in the middle at the far right. So we can also describe a hydrogen as being a primary, secondary, or tertiary hydrogen. And what gives the hydrogen its characteristic is the carbon that it is bonded to. So a primary carbon has primary hydrogens, and a secondary carbon has only secondary hydrogens, and a tertiary carbon has only tertiary hydrogens. For shorthand, we use special symbols so that we don't have to write out the words primary, secondary, or tertiary. And so what the symbol primary is, 1 with a degree sign stands for primary, 2 with a degree sign stands for secondary, and 3 with a degree sign stands for tertiary. And so I'm going to use the shorthand very often because just like all other chemists, I'm a little bit lazy and I don't want to write out the word. And it's much faster to write out the symbol than a word. Okay. Nomenclature of alkanes. So here we're going to learn our very first rule on naming an alkane. And the first rule is to identify the longest continuous chain. So having the longest continuous chain, that is going to be numbered, and you're going to put carbon 1 of the longest continuous carbon chain on the side of the chain that has a branch point closest to the end. So for example, if you look at this molecule on the right, instead of starting on the left and numbering from the left, we started at the right and numbered to the left. And that is because the branch point is closer to the terminus from the right. And if you look at the molecule to the left of that one, again, they started at the right. And the only reason we start at the right is because the branch point is closest to the end of the right terminus. The terminus being the end of a chain. And then on the molecule below, we started at the right and went down and over because there were more carbons down in a downward direction. So what we do is we first identify the longest continuous carbon chain and number that chain, and we number from the side that has a branching point closest to the terminus. So let's write that down. Number from the carbon terminus closest to a branch or a heteroatom. It doesn't necessarily have to be a chain of carbons, but we'll cover heteroatoms in a few slides. So we have 4 different alkanes here. Notice that on the first alkane in this series of 3 at the top right, we counted 8 carbons and they have named it 4-methyl octane. Notice that the methyl group is bonded to carbon 4. Then to the molecule to the right of that one, we have an octane, another 8-carbon molecule. And notice that at carbon 4, there are 2 carbons not highlighted in yellow because they are not in the branch. A 2-carbon branch is called an ethyl group, and they say that it is a 4-ethyl group, and the 4 indicates that ethyl is at carbon 4. And then below, the molecule at the bottom of the slide, 4-propyl octane, notice that the 4 is indicating that there is a propyl group bonded to carbon 4 of the chain. So then we can practice numbering our chains, and I've drawn a structure which I transferred to the next slide. So identifying the longest carbon chain. Now, I have chosen to number from this side of the molecule because the branch point is only 1 or 2 carbons from the end, where on the other side the branch point is 2 to 3 carbons from the terminus. So at that point, when I have decided where to start numbering from, I have to then determine what is the longest chain. So my initial attempt to number, I have found a 7-carbon chain. But if you notice, this branch point only contains 2 carbons, but the branch point below it contains 3 carbons. So that was not the best choice for numbering. If we move forward, we can also look at, now we have found an 8-carbon chain. Notice that instead of picking this 1-carbon branch, I have started with this 2-carbon, what looks like a 2-carbon branch, and that gave me a longer chain by 1 carbon. But still, it's not the best, probably because carbon 7 and 8 are only 2 carbons, whereas below I have a branch that contains 3 carbons. So if we continue attempting to find the longest chain, we can move forward and try numbering again. And here I have chosen this 2-carbon branch for my right-hand terminus and the 3-carbon branch for my left-hand terminus. Oh, I guess that was right, opposite. So 2-carbon branch for the left-hand terminus and 3-carbon branch for the right-hand terminus. And that gave me a chain that was 9 carbons long, and that is actually the longest chain that I have found. And even if we attempt to number in a different way from there forward, we're still not going to find a 9-carbon chain. So that means that this molecule should be labeled as a nonane. And from there, you can, once you've labeled the main chain, then you can figure out where your branches are. You have a 1-carbon branch at carbon 3 and a 2-carbon branch at 6. And then we have to remember that a 1-carbon branch is called a methyl and a 2-carbon branch is called an ethyl. And so I would name this molecule, and I would put methyl and ethyl, you have to put them in alphabetical order. So at carbon 6, I have ethyl, which comes alphabetically before methyl. And then at carbon 3, I have methyl. Oh, by the way, if you don't put these dashes in your mastering, then they will count it wrong. So don't forget your dashes. A letter is always separated from a number by a dash. And then from there, we would call it a nonane with no space between methyl and nonane.